Hey, if you're watching right now, so I have this thing set up, and there's this frame. I'm so bad at OBS, like just so incredibly bad at OBS. But as soon as this Zoom call goes, it'll all make sense because we'll be side by side, and it'll be amazing. Right now, it's just silly because it's just a view of my chin while I get set up. So. Um, Anyway, hey, if you're in here today, I want to thank you for hanging out with us and spending some time with us. Um, I think Tom will be here pretty soon. And yeah, if you have any questions, I have a bunch of questions. Uh, nice chin though. Thanks, Brent. I appreciate it. Good to see you, by the way. How you doing? How you doing? I want to get you on this show one of these days. I hope you're ready. I'm gonna be coming for you pretty quick. Um, yeah. So yeah, we're gonna get started pretty soon. But right now we're just kind of hanging out, getting set up, waiting a little bit. But yeah, hit me up with your questions. I have a big, big Notion file that I'm going to be asking questions from, so we'll kind of go from there. But if you have stuff that I haven't already thought of, man, I would love to hear about it. So yeah, just throw those in there, and I will try to get to them. We'll see how it goes. We might have kind of like a dedicated, question time, where you can ask questions, or maybe you can just queue them up, and I will get to them. Let's see how we're doing. I'm going to squat for a second. One thing that I always end up doing is that I forget that not everybody um, does the whole like calendar thing. And so sometimes I um, don't send them the link to the Zoom call. And then they're like chilling out, just like, hey, where's that link? Okay. Get that right now, just in case. Can you hear everything all right? Brent, if you can hear everything all right, let me know. Make sure it doesn't sound like peaky or anything like that. We should be covered. All the levels look good on my side, and when I checked, it didn't sound too terrible. But we have had issues in the past, so I'd like to avoid that. Awesome. Here, I'm gonna get back in the zone. Hey, it's Swix. What's up? Good to see you, friend. Have any of you played with this thing yet? Redwood? It's pretty new to me because I don't actually have a need for like a full stack framework yet. But man, I was playing with it this week and I'm just blown away. It's so cool. Oh, Swix is going to bed. Hey, well, I appreciate you coming by and saying hi. Makes me feel good. Thanks for the love, my man. I'm still not in a perfect spot. I'm gonna look super silly as soon as Tom gets in here. It's like, why are you squatting, bro? Just trying to get my reps in while I can. Swick says Redwood cells are part of my pitch for single file components in React. Interesting. I like that. Brent. I did the tutorial, looked really promising. Yeah. It is. I'm kind of curious, like, have you done anything with I need to like put my hands up to like utilize this space. Have you done anything with Rails, or has it always been like primarily JavaScripty type stuff? Um, because I, I was getting some just major Rails feelings as I was going through some of the tutorial, and it just made me so happy. Just made me so happy. especially since I've been kind of I've been one of these like negative folks who are just like, yeah, if I was gonna build an app today, I'd build it in Rails. Like, screw as much as I like React, that or like Laravel maybe even. But this has me rethinking some stuff. Oh yes, it's that time. Tom,
Hello.
hey,
Hey, how's it going?
good, good. It's going really good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Welcome to React Podcast.
Thank you very much. Ooh, are you going to stand the whole time?
I am. I found out like a long time ago that I just think better like when I'm standing, and so I get a little bit lazy, and I think this standing helps me a little bit in constructing questions and I don't know whatnot.
That's fair. You can't fall asleep while you're standing, right?
That is the truth. You can't fall asleep while you're standing. You got a haircut since last I saw you
I
in video
I
form.
did. I got tired of worrying about where I was going to, like how I was going to deal with my hair, and I was like, how I can take care of my hair for like 6 months? Yep.
Yep, yep. Yeah, we have one of those as well, and it's just yeah, it's a godsend. I actually got my first haircut, and it was super weird getting a haircut in a mask because they're just constantly having to like fiddle with it like all the
Oh
time.
yeah,
But
yeah. Yeah, I haven't been to a haircutter in a long time, and
yeah,
so, but I did. I have people I know in Berlin, and they're more open over there, but they do wear masks when they get haircuts, and they were like, the person takes the little thing off, does your ear, and they put it back on.
yeah, it's wild. It's wild. Um, well, hey, I am super, 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 super excited to have you on the show today. We haven't. I'll let you know when we're like fully starting, but I'm just personal note, just super thrilled to meet you. And I've just been a huge fan of so much of the work that you've put out. So it's a real honor to be able to talk with you today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited too.
So yeah, so what I'm hoping to cover today, I'd mentioned a little bit of this in some of our messages, was just kind of exposing some of the React audience that we have to Redwood. And I think since March, and I'll probably re-preface some of this, but like since March, I know I've had this kind of feeling of like, man, like if I was going to build a product today, if I was responsible for the whole thing, like what would I reach for? It would probably be like Rails or Laravel. And I think a lot of people have been, pointing me to Redwood, and so I wanted to kind of get you on. And for anyone who is not familiar with what it is, I just want to cover the basics of like kind of like what the philosophy of it is. I think your experience in Rails is going to come up quite a bit, because I feel like while they're not like similar or like solving the same issue in the same way by any means,
Mhm.
it seems very influenced by, and you've brought a lot of value from some of those old guard frameworks. So I think that's kind of like the big core of like what we want to cover today. And I think the three, I mean, we'll talk a lot about the actual stack, but I really want to make sure that we hammer on kind of some of the unique verbiage around cells, services, and sides. Um,
Perfect.
yeah, and I think, yeah, anything else that you think or that you have found is kind of challenging for newcomers to the framework?
Um, well, we talk about, I mean, just in terminology perspectives, we talk about being edge ready. So we could talk about
Sure.
I could talk about the big dream of Redwood, sort of the long-term
Okay.
dream, and why it's sort of architected the way it is. So talking about edge readiness and being ready to be a fully distributed, like easily scalable
Perfect.
thing. So we can talk about that. Otherwise, getting into it, I mean, new people always have trouble with, I mean, React and GraphQL are complicated in their own special way. I mean,
Yep. Yep.
React especially, once you get into it. GraphQL, it can be challenging when I mean, GraphQL has its own challenges with
Sure.
terminology. So I think it's, new people that don't have a lot of experience, like those are primarily their challenges. If you come into it and you know React and you know GraphQL and you've worked with databases before, then it's really about then it's just the intricacies of the architecture. Like how is it deployed? Where do the different things live? Like why did you choose GraphQL as a transport
Sure.
protocol? Like those are kind of some of the questions that people would normally have. But I mean,
The normal hangups.
it's really just codifying a fairly normal set of technologies and just trying to integrate them really beautifully. Like that's the bulk of it. So I can't think of any specific questions. Like often it will be like, where are the boundaries of a Redwood thing? And especially like where's the boundaries between the services logic and the database part, like Prisma, for people that aren't super familiar with doing databases, which, like people come in and they're like, oh, Jamstack, I could do full stack. I want to do that so I can build a real product, but I'm a front-end developer and I haven't used databases a lot. And so I don't understand like what Prisma is doing for me and like what the boundary of that is.
Yeah. And I mean, Prisma itself is, we just did an episode recently on Prisma, and it is it's so incredibly nuanced, like what it actually is. And so, I'm definitely one of those more like front-end designery type people. So, I'll be asking a lot of those questions in earnest today.
Fair enough.
Cool. Yeah. So I think in terms of Arc, I was kind of thinking about talking about your experience and kind of like why Redwood. And if I understand correctly, you're using Redwood to build Chatterbug.
Not exactly.
Not. Okay.
Redwood actually comes out of some learnings from Chatterbug. Chatterbug right now is a Rails app. That's how we started it like 4.5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It has since started to look a lot more like a Redwood app. So it's React on the front end. It's talking GraphQL, but it talks GraphQL to a Rails-based GraphQL API.
Okay.
Right. But in doing that, we were like, man, I wish we could just do the whole thing in JavaScript.
Right.
Right. And then it's like, well, we have those pieces exist, and you could deploy it to like Netlify or something. Right. And you get this like easy scaling. You don't have to worry about anything. It's super simple for, in the normal case. And like, why has nobody leveraged this yet? Why has nobody done that?
Cool. So we'll cover that stuff. We'll talk about kind of like what it looks like maybe just after that to market this product in today's landscape. So I think the marketing side of it, how it compares conceptually to, Gatsby, Next, some of the other things. And then some of the more technical stuff towards the end. And then at the end, I usually like to ask people kind of like what they're excited about for the future. And I think that kind of your maybe like 3-year goal for what Redwood and, full stack, Jamstack looks like would be a really good fit for closing.
Okay, let me go. I'm just going to refill my water here.
Yep, of course. No problem. Yeah, sorry for the super letterbox thing. I forgot to change it into gallery view. Sorry, I'm talking about. There's a couple messages on the YouTube channel. Like, what's this letterbox thing? Cool, awesome. Well, then we can get started. If you don't have any questions for me, if you could just do a local recording for me, that would be great.
Sure. Let me get that going.
And it can be, QuickTime, or if you have an audio software that you really enjoy.
Yeah, I just use QuickTime.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
It's running.
Perfect. I'll just say, welcome to React Podcast. You can say hi, and then we'll kind of like take it from there.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Cool. In 3, 2, 1. Tom Preston-Werner, welcome to React Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I am super excited to have you on the show. I guess just on a personal note, more than anything, I'm excited to have someone on the show who has, like, for the last 10 or so years, really influenced the way that I work as a developer. So I'm going to gush for a second. You're the founder of GitHub. You created Jekyll, Semver, Toml, Gravatar, like things that actually like impact my life like on a daily basis. So on behalf of anyone who's listening, whose life you've also impacted, thank you so much for being here and talking with us today.
Well, thank you for saying so. It's absolutely my pleasure. I mean, I love creating things. I love bringing value to the world and making other people's lives easier. I'm a developer, and it brings me great joy to be able to help other developers have more enjoyable lives. And so I'm absolutely pleased to have done those things, for you to enjoy them, and to be here to talk about
Yeah.
stuff.
So this year has been kind of like a funny year, and I feel like you're the person to talk to about this. I mean, a
It's
funny
an
year on
understatement.
yeah. I forgot about all the other things because I was just thinking about like React for right now. But yes, it's been a chaotic year. Um, but I know at the beginning of the year, people really started to ask me a lot. I went on a couple podcasts talking about, if you were to build something today, what would you reach for? Like if you're going to build a product, not just, some type of front end for an existing product or, an integration or a UI, like if you're going to build a product, what would you reach for? And I feel like in React, I've not had an answer for that. And so it's always been like, well, I'd probably reach for something, that I know pretty well, like Rails or Laravel or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And, as I've had those conversations with people like on this show or other shows, Redwood keeps coming up. And it wasn't until recently that I kind of like got a glimpse as to like what this is. But you have built one of the flagship Rails apps in GitHub. And now you're building a framework to bring some of those like full stack ergonomics to React. And I guess my big question that I want to start off, like kick this all off with is, when you have so much muscle memory and power in the tool of Rails, what is it that inspires you when you're building your next product, your next service, your next startup to kind of sit down and start thinking about a framework from the ground up?
The journey really for me from Rails to wanting to work on Redwood and build a new framework started kind of gradually. So Chatterbug is the current startup that I have for language learning. And we started it out with just plain vanilla Rails, like everything done the normal, simple, easy way, server-side rendered, like nothing fancy on the JavaScript side, just jQuery. This was like 5 years ago. And then we started building more and more front-end stuff. And we had a designer who was also a developer, and he wanted to use React. And I hadn't really used React much before, but he started building things with it. And I started to dabble with it and learning React. And I was just blown away by how much better the paradigm of building front end with React is, right? So it's like there's jQuery over here. That was what I was used to. And then there's React over here. And I'm like just delete all of the jQuery stuff, like immediately, right? Like we have to do everything. Everything new has to be done with React, right? And I just started getting into it and really loving everything that everyone loves about React, right? Which is like, it just simplifies the way that you build front ends. It compartmentalizes it. You get the one-way data reflowing when you change stuff. Like it's the dream that I kind of always had, the thing that I always wanted when I was writing front ends, And in jQuery, you're like, let me fiddly find this thing by ID and then like change the text. And React is like, no, just change just change this variable and just like boop, right? And I was like, oh yes, like I need that. So we started using more React, and then over time, we started feeling like, okay, we had Rails on the back end. Now it was just delivering like JSON to the front end,
Sure.
And then the React component would, we had a page and it would just suck in the JSON and it would kind of do the whole thing. So it was still, the server side basically doing all the work of data processing, giving that to the front end and doing it. And then we're like, well, what would be really nice is if we could break up our data fetching and like get different things at different times, so you could have a page load incrementally. And so then we started pulling in GraphQL. And so now we ended up with a Rails app that was really just a GraphQL API, right? And so that's mostly what it looks like with today for most of the site, everything new that we're doing. It looks like that. So at the same time, another guy that was working with us at the time, Peter Pistorius, I started noodling with him on like, what, why do we have to still use Rails to do the backend? Like JavaScript has become an amazing language. It's really enjoyable. It's really great. The package management system is vibrant, to say the least.
Yeah.
And like, why am I having to context switch between Ruby and JavaScript? Like we have Node, we have Apollo, like all of the things exist. Like we could implement the GraphQL side with Apollo, do it all in JavaScript. And then we need to figure out the database side. But like we started thinking about what that would look like.
Sure.
And combine that with some of the new stuff that Netlify had come out with. Well, not that new at the time, maybe a year before we started working on Redwood, which is already like a year and a half or almost 2 years ago, around functions. So in Netlify, they launched the feature they call functions, Netlify functions, where you just have a file in your Git repository that you want deployed to Lambda, right? And they will then do that for you, right? So you have just like a single code file. It represents your Lambda handler. You push it to GitHub, they suck it in, they deploy it, they deploy, your static stuff to their CDN, and they deploy your Lambda, your function, right, to Lambda for you. You don't even have to have an AWS account or anything. And now you can have dynamic code running, and you can talk, your front end via JavaScript, static JavaScript or static HTML with some JavaScript can talk to the Lambda and do dynamic stuff, right? And so I saw that, and I was like, these are now the building blocks that you could use to build a full stack application.
Yeah.
Right. If you're thinking in the React way, which is I have a static React client that can be delivered via CDN. Okay. So it's available everywhere, super fast. And then that's going to just talk to Lambdas, which theoretically you could have distributed everywhere.
Sure. Yep.
And that could be the business logic. And in the case of Redwood, you wrap up an entire GraphQL API into a Lambda and deploy it onto a Lambda. And then the database is the kind of the hard part, and it's still the hard part because this is like this Jamstack mentality of how you architect this and deploy it was created almost antithetically. And Jekyll was really in the early days of that, at the very beginning of this sort of like getting away from databases. So it's maybe a little ironic that I'm now like, hey, databases again with the Jamstack. So maybe I'm a hypocrite, but like sometimes you need a database, right? Like if I'm building an application, a web app, I need a database, right? Like I can't do everything I want to do in the content sort of, I'm not going to use Jekyll to build a web application. Right?
Yeah.
Like that's just not going to work for me. It doesn't make sense.
Well, it's truly fascinating to me because, you've been on both sides of this. You have Jekyll that is, as far as I recall, it's like kind of the OG of static site generation. But then you also have, these super dynamic sites on Rails. And it's really fascinating, this experience that you've had, because I've seen it repeatedly, right? Like at some point you're doing so much on the front end, so many like API calls, you're redesigning your RESTful endpoints for, specifically for your like new front end code. And at some point you're like, what is Rails really getting me besides doing this stuff in Ruby, which is kind of a weird language anyway.
Ruby has its its trade-offs. Ruby is amazing. I still love Ruby.
Yeah.
But it's if I'm going to write my front end in JavaScript, which I really want to, then I'd also like to write my back end in JavaScript.
Yeah. So one thing I'm kind of curious about in this phase is I feel like maybe 9 or 10 years ago, I'm probably getting my timeline off, but there was this huge move early on to it with let's see, like Meteor and Derby, I think were really early on in this kind of like full stack JavaScript type of movement.
Oh yeah.
And it was all like, NoSQL databases, like it was just JavaScript all the way down. And I think, I don't want to condemn it, but it seems like most of those projects have kind of like fallen off and they've been replaced by other projects. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what did we get wrong about, full stack JavaScript then that has become more realistic over the time? Like, why is now the right time to start doing that? What are the tools that make it possible?
I think Meteor was too early. Like there may be even the right solution, but just too early. And this happens sometimes with technology.
Sure.
You can have like the right technology at the wrong time. And you have to remember also at the time that Meteor was around, there was no package management system. Like they had to build literally everything themselves. And they built like a hosting thing for it. So, just from my own personal experience, I remember reading about Meteor and being like, this seems really cool, but I feel like it's too locked in. And I think those impressions weren't even true. And maybe that was a problem with the marketing, but like my perception of it was that like if I built a thing with Meteor, then I had to pay for this other thing. And I didn't really it didn't feel as open source as I kind of wanted it to be.
Yeah.
So that's just for me why I never really ended up playing with Meteor. But the lessons there, I think, are just like it was too big of a leap, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was like asking people to abandon like everything that they knew, like everything, right? It's
Right,
like,
right.
oh, you do Rails, guess what? You don't do any, like you don't, literally nothing is the same, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Everything changes. And so the gamble with Redwood is that I think it's time now to start integrating in the
Mm,
JavaScript world. Like we have all of these amazing pieces. And so part of the nice thing about Redwood is that it's not, everything is not new. It's saying, Redwood is saying, you already use React. You've used it in projects before. You probably have used GraphQL if you're using React, at least in some capacity. And if those things are true, then let me help you use them more effectively. And if you
sure.
want to build a full stack web application, then guess what? I'm also going to give you Prisma and I'm going to integrate that really well and give you scaffolding like, Rails has for easily building out your sort of initial interfaces. And I'm going to integrate all that together like beautifully and simply and give you generators and some of the really nice things that we expect now in a framework that Rails made us expect because
Mm-hmm.
Rails pioneered so many of these things. And but they're just not present in the JavaScript world, right? It's like the state of the art is create React app and you're like, all right, hit create React app and like good luck.
See you on the other
And
side. Tell us what you made.
right, and you're on your own, right? So now
Yeah.
you're like, oh man, like I gotta figure out how to do everything. You have to make a million choices, and then
Yeah.
everyone's React based application ends up being totally completely different, down to the file structure,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? You show up at a new company and you're like, all right, I'm ready to get started on your React, web app. And then like you got to spend the first week just figuring out like where files go,
Oh, yeah, yeah. And
right?
all
Because
the local
everyone does it differently.
conventions. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So,
And
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
so Redwood is in a lot of ways just standardization. It's if Redwood is anything, it's standardization and integration,
Hmm.
right? And what we say is we do all the hard work for you. We configure Webpack for you so that you don't have to, so that you can focus on your product, which is exactly the same thing that Rails did 15 years ago, 20 years ago almost.
Now, one thing that is, I think, maybe a little bit different about Rails is there's this huge kind of mindset of like configure or convention over configuration. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, I got it right. Sometimes I flip those. There's this whole mindset, that's the big thing, and they leverage Ruby quite a bit to actually make that happen and to kind of infer a lot of details based on namings of things and the
Right.
place that they live and whatnot. And I'm curious. Um, I know that can be a hindrance a lot of times in adopting a framework, and I'm curious: does Redwood kind of have those same types of convention over configuration and trying to do some of the same things in the same way, or um, does it leverage more just the generators of putting things in a place that makes sense and then kind of letting you just use JavaScript and React as you normally would?
I think it's we don't really talk about it because I think that idea of convention over configuration has just permeated software development so much that it's like it would be weird if it wasn't that way for
Sure.
any project where you're like the first thing I have to do is write 100 lines of config. I mean, I guess Webpack is a little bit that way, but they've made that a lot better too, right? Like you can get started with Webpack really easily, but like once you get into Webpack, it's like, oh man, like you got to really understand what it's doing. Like you
Sure.
got to watch 10 hours of video on like the internals of Webpack to do certain things. But that's because it's just such a powerful, like it's just like that's what Webpack is for. Webpack is so that you can like do anything in the
Yeah.
build process. And so for Redwood, we don't really talk about it. Like it's just that's just the way it is. It's kind of it's just there. So, right. So there is minimal configuration. There's configuration where you might want it, but like there's defaults. So I guess today we think of it more that we just have sane defaults. So I think and that's like the common expression of convention over configuration. What it has become is just sane defaults, and your project better have sane defaults or just nobody's going to use it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I know, and I listened to an episode of Friend First where we talked with Sam Selikoff and Ryan Toronto, and you were talking about how it can be really difficult in a long-lived Rails app or like a Ruby app, to be more honest, where things kind of happen at levels that you don't really understand, and you can insert a, I guess, a preference at a level that's really hard to find. And I'm kind of curious how JavaScript solves that. Like, does JavaScript solve it by being like a less like meta programmable language, or is that something that you guard as kind of the designers of the framework?
I think JavaScript does solve it by being less meta programming, which I really like.
Sure.
Like my main problems with Rails are in its sort of magical elements. Like it can be too much magic. Like when we were building GitHub, honestly, going into it, I had done a lot of Rails. I was doing a lot of Rails, and honestly, I wanted to do less Rails. And so I wanted to write the backend stuff. And so I wrote Grit, which is it was the Ruby to Git bindings so that we could read the Git repository from disk in Ruby, turn it into Ruby objects, and then be able to express those through the front end through Rails. And I went out and I asked Chris Wanstroth, my co-founder, one of the co-founders at GitHub, if he wanted to join and help me build the Rails part of it. Because I honestly didn't want to build the Rails part of it because there's just like there's like too much complexity and magic there for me, honestly. Like I wanted to write a pure Ruby library where I had complete control over everything. And like no one was trying to do a bunch of fancy stuff for me. So I honestly don't love as much magic as there is in Rails. And I really, really dislike like meta programming functions, like cobbling functions together by iterating over strings and like defining the functions based on the string names. Like I just can't, I have a very low tolerance for that level because it makes it impossible to find anything. Like your search becomes useless. And so I don't love that. And it makes it hard to maintain things. And just the magic and the automatic like loading of things can get, I mean, well, that's probably a bad example because that's actually really nice. But like there's just, well, Rails, right? Like there's a lot of hidden things, and the framework itself is like, how much code is in the framework of Rails? Like it's a large amount.
Yeah.
And so Redwood is actually pretty minimal. Like the weight of Redwood itself is really low. We do very few magical things for you. There's a few things that we do around cells, which are the declarative sort of data fetching. We do a little bit of automatic loading in the routes file, because otherwise if you have 200 routes, you have 200 import statements for like every page component that you import, which I didn't like. So but that's just like a little thing. It's like, oh, you don't have to manually import them. Like that's it. Like, yeah, it's magic, but it's like a 20-line code file that does that in Webpack, or it's in Babel now. Everything's in Babel now. Everything has come out of Webpack as much as possible. It goes into Babel so we can support TypeScript properly. But I like having less magic. I like being able to statically analyze my code for the most part. Like that is a valuable thing. Ruby is inscrutable. Like to build tooling around Ruby is like almost impossible because of the meta programming.
Yeah. Well, this is something that has really struck me in my very limited exposure to Redwood, through the tutorial, is that it has an explicitness that I really like. And I almost want to say like tasteful magic. There's like tasteful little bits of magic that's like, you know what, I can see how that's valuable. Like I don't want to, like I think the way that you're using, workspaces is a really good example of that. Instead of having to, kind of navigate down to that root directory and then back up to whatever you want to import, just you got a workspace for it, source, like you're good to go. And it does feel like there's a lot of things that kind of help with the ergonomics, help it feel frameworky, but like don't feel like this big top down, we know all the ways that you should be building a React app. It feels very much like a React app that I have full control over right out of the box.
Yeah. And you can, this is the thing, Redwood's not going to really prevent you from doing or using any normal library that you would want to use. It's like you want to use a state management library, Redux or Recoil, whatever, MobX, like go for it. We don't have an opinion on that currently. We might in the future, but we currently don't. Or CSS framework, like we don't care. Like there are some choices that we decided that we couldn't make because they would be too restrictive for people, right? If you say like, oh, in a Redwood app, you have to use Tailwind CSS, and anyone who didn't want to do that would be like, well, I guess this framework's not for me. So whenever those questions would come up, if there was an answer where someone would say, oh, well, I guess Redwood's not for me because of that choice. I mean, some of them are basic choices like, oh, you're going to use React And honestly, that's not even necessarily one. Like right now, we have chosen React as what we use for our web side. So in Redwood, there are sides. There's the web side, which is your front end. And then there's the API side, which is your back end. And for the website, we've chosen React, but there's no reason that we couldn't in the future create a different web side that used Vue. Like there's nothing fundamental about the framework that would prevent you from doing that. It's just a technology choice that we made because that's what we were working with and that's what we like best. But you could imagine doing that because architecturally, a Redwood application is a statically deliverable front end that talks GraphQL to a GraphQL API. And it doesn't even have to be like the sides don't even have to be the web, right? From the very beginning, and the reason that we use GraphQL and focus on making it really nice and easy to build a GraphQL API is because it means that you can build a client in anything. And it means you only have to build your API once, right? So the common pattern has been for a long time, like if you started with a Rails app, so anyone who started with a Rails app is like, okay, Rails, boom, you got your Rails app. It's all server side, delivers, your generated HTML to the browser, like you're done, right? And that's how it works. There's little bits of JavaScript. And then you're like, hey, time to build a mobile application, right? And you're like, okay, sweet. We're going to use, we're going to build it with whatever, but like you want to start using GraphQL. Maybe you chose React Native, right? So you can use GraphQL, or you use anything and you want to use GraphQL. So GraphQL is amazing. And now you're like, okay, crap. Well, I guess we'll build out, GraphQL API also in the Rails app, or even if you're doing RESTful stuff, like you're still building out a whole separate, like bunch of RESTful endpoints. Like the dream that Rails had where it's like, oh, your pages are also RESTful endpoint. Like I've never, like, I don't buy it.
Yeah. I've never seen anything that doesn't end up having like some amalgamation APIs that are like, when you have to actually start serving customers like through an API. And
yeah, they're different. Like you have to, you iterate on them differently. They get versioned separately. Like they're just different. They're a different thing. Like if you're going to do it for real, like you're building a separate API. If you're doing it in REST, it's a separate thing.
Sure.
If you choose GraphQL, obviously that's a separate thing. And so now you're building out this totally separate API. Okay. So now you've got your main site in Rails that's spitting out web pages, and you've got an API that like your clients are going to use.
Yeah.
And then you start, and now you're doing, everything that you build, you have to do twice.
Yeah.
Everything you build, right? If your mobile client is doing like all of the things that your web client is doing, guess what? You're essentially building it twice. Or you're building it in one place, you have to hook it into two different places. Anyway, the complexity is increasing. And so I don't like that, because that's what we ended up doing at Chatterbug. Guess what? Rails site, normal stuff, also GraphQL API. Now you got to do things twice. So learning lessons from that in Redwood, we say, well, we can build mobile clients all day long, and it's great. Actually, they perform really well. They're resilient to like data issues because they're cell phones. Like they need to do the things that cell phones do. They're optimized for performance. And so like, if that's a totally normal thing to do, to build a mobile app that way, then why are we not building our web apps that way? Right? Like it's not really any different.
Sure.
So then we can just have everything read from a GraphQL API. And then my backend is literally just a GraphQL API. And now I only have to build things once.
Yeah. Well, this is really interesting because there is this notion of, hey, I want to decouple my front end and my back end. But unfortunately, what we've seen is that makes a really kind of terrible developer experience a lot of times, especially if a lot of times we, put stuff into like serverless, which is kind of historically, it's getting better, but been really difficult to develop against locally. And so you build this front end, and I feel like GraphQL kind of like came in and helps out a little bit, but it's always felt super fractured. And I think the really interesting thing that you're doing about Redwood, and kind of you talked about sides, is that you have the web side, you have the API side, but you're developing them together, and you've built a framework around building them together, but with extensible sides. So it's not just these two sides forever. Like you're building them separate but together so that you can build as many of these sides as you need.
Yeah, and it's all in the same repository, right? So a Redwood repository is a mono repo. It's actually two projects, right? We use Yarn, so we have workspaces. The workspaces come from Yarn, and then you can operate on them independently. And when you build, you have different environments, right? Because the target for the website is a browser, and the target for the API side is a node runtime.
Sure.
And so if you, the problem, and like some people are trying to do things where they erase this difference, where it's like you pretend like it's all one thing, but the reality is it's not all one thing. Like the code that runs in the browser and the code that runs in Node on some server somewhere, let's have different restrictions. They have different performance characteristics, and you're mentally, you're just doing different things. And so I think you can get the illusion that that's going to help you out, that it's like, oh, look how easy it is to pretend that these two things are the same.
Sure.
Like Next has this sort of philosophy where it's like, oh, look, they're the same. And it's like, they're not the same. Like, I don't want you to tell me that they're the same when they're not the same. Like, I'm a developer, I'm a responsible developer. And so I need to know what's going on and like, stop trying to confuse me about like what runs where, right? So Redwood's like, you know what runs where.
Right. That is interesting. And I feel like Next, over this past year has really kind of backed out of, I feel like they used to be the same exact API calls, and now they're kind of like backing out of that a little bit. So you have like certain calls that, run on the server side, certain that run on the client side, and you can like attack them differently, which I feel is exactly to your point, where as a developer, you know that they're different and you don't want to have to pretend that they're the same thing, because they're not. Now I want to back up.
I just don't want to be, I get confused enough as a programmer. Like I don't need additional layers of confusion.
Right. Now I want to back up a little bit and cover some of the parts of Redwood. So we talk about Redwood, but what are some of the technologies that it actually uses to accomplish the goal of providing this full stack, Jamstack type of development experience?
Like technology wise, or like Netlify stuff, or
technology
wise
specifically? In terms of, because you mentioned Prisma is one of the tools that you're using, GraphQL, I guess those types of things.
Yeah. So as I said before, it's a React client on the front end. So React, and you would choose probably some way to do CSS. You might choose some way to do state management, but people do that less now that with hooks, like things have become a lot simpler. And that's kind of your React front end. Mm-hmm. And then the API is built right now. We use Apollo, and we like it for the most part. I think it's pretty heavyweight on both the client and the server. I mean, it's more important on the client to be light. And Apollo 3 actually reduced the bundle size nicely, which we love.
Great.
Right? Because bundle size is always a performance concern. This is a concern that we have. Like we build new technology and we find out like this thing is amazing and now this thing is worse. Right. So with this type of architecture, you're delivering like a bunch of JavaScript to the client that they have to parse and run. And in the olden days, in the Rails way, you're just like, here's like a tiny bit of HTML and CSS. Right. Like, and that's nice, but it's trade-offs, right? Like with the React front end, I get these really nice things. Anyway, so on the back end, we use Apollo. We use Apollo client on the front end, Apollo server on the back end. And then in your GraphQL API, so Apollo server to build the GraphQL API. And we have some really nice, there are some little bits of magic there that make building your GraphQL API like way easier than you thought it could ever be.
Okay.
And you should go do the tutorial. Like if you want to check out what I mean by that, go do the tutorial on Redwood. It's amazing. It's the best tutorial you'll have ever done.
Absolutely.
And so you build your GraphQL API, but you're not even thinking about Apollo. Like there's nothing there that's Apollo specific. Like we could swap that out with something else if we wanted, because you're not doing anything Apollo specific in the back end. And so in there, if you want to connect to a database, if you want a full stack application, which is probably why you're using Redwood in the first place, you're going to use a database. And so we use Prisma, which is a query builder, or it's like an ORM. They don't want to call it an ORM. It's kind of an ORM. But it's not, but really it's just delivering you back like a data structure. Like it doesn't, in the active record way, it's like, here's a model and it's like everything and you call stuff on it. In Prisma, it's literally just like, here's some JSON, basically. It's just an object. It's just a plain JavaScript object with some data fields on it that represents what you got back from your data query. And then you have to modify it, right? Separately. And you do it in Redwood, you do it in a functional way. We're not big on classes, where we think more in packages and functions than we do in classes. Where it's not we don't use a lot of the class-based stuff in JavaScript. So those are the fundamental pieces that are at runtime. So also at dev time, we've integrated testing with Jest and Storybook with Storybook. So those two things are integrated, and part of the dream of the development flow, which maybe initially you're not using Storybook as much, and none of us write as many tests as we should, as responsibly as we should, but you always want to feel like you can. And so but where these things really shine is when you start getting a little further. And a dream that I've always had for like 10 years, since the GitHub days, like one big problem that we always had was you have some piece of a page that's like deep inside your site that's behind auth, and it only comes up in certain circumstances, and you're trying to work on it. And you're like I got to get my database into a state where it's going to show this page. And then I got it logged in as this kind of user that has these characteristics. And you spend like a half an hour just like setting up the data to get you there. And then you're like, finally I can like see my code and like write it. And my dream has always been to be able to write web front end code without it being in my application. Right. And this is actually, if you are familiar with Mustache or Friends, that actually that was a concept that I stumbled. I didn't write Mustache, but Chris did. Chris Wanstroth, co-founder, and that came from a conversation that we had in a bar where I had come across this library that Google had called C tags, I think, and it was this logicless templating language.
Yeah.
Right. And I saw it and I thought, this would be really cool, because it would allow you to build all your HTML and stuff. And you'd have just your data bits that would be sort of templatized in there, a little bit of, like it's logicless, but you can do like if that, Boolean stuff in there. And then you could develop it in isolation.
Yeah.
Right. So this was like 10 years ago that I was thinking about that and thinking about how cool that would be. And Chris took that and like ran and like created Mustache, and that created this entire like universe of templating stuff. Like Twitter uses it now, and handlebars, right? Like those are the kind of the same ilk of things. But I was always chasing this idea that like, if you could develop your chunks of your web application outside of your application, it would be so amazing, because then the other thing you could do is like change the data and be like, all right, this Boolean is true. And this, here's the name and here's the whatever, and just fill it out. And it'd be like, all right, here's what your thing looks like. Right.
Yeah.
And guess exactly what that is today? Storybook. Storybook is that. And React makes that possible. And Storybook makes that possible. And it's the most amazing thing. Like once you're into it and you're like, all right, I have to design a component that is a flag. So like on Chatterbug, we have language flags. And there's a bunch of them.
Yep.
And you're like, okay, I'm going to develop this flag thing. I got to make sure it works right. And it's going to have these 7 flags, and they got to be able to be, they can render in these 4 different sizes based on these parameters. And we use Storybook, and it's just like iterate over these, 3 sizes and these 7 flags and just show them all to me. And it's just like, and I can go in there and I can change anything. And it's just like, and like, that's beautiful. Like I don't have to make my app show me a French flag in medium size and then be like, all right, let me fiddle with that. It's the culmination. These technologies now are the culmination of this like dream that I've had for like a decade about what developing a web application could be like all these different ideas that I've talked to so many people about over so many years are finally like coming together. And deployment. We haven't even talked about deployment.
Well, I want to gush on Storybook for a little bit longer, because that was one of the things that I was super excited to see when I went through that tutorial, use the generator, and it was like, boom, like, home.stories.js. And I was like, holy cow, like this is exactly like what I want, because of exactly everything that you described. One of the things that I hate about working in full stack apps is that nobody ever thinks about how you go back and modify that thing. And so, you have these situations where it's like, now you got to, every designer on your team has to be at least a little bit full stack in order to kind of munge the data in the database to get, the flag to show up or the user type to show up and all of that. And it's like, it's such a waste of expertise and energy to have to do that every time, when you can just see like, hey, I have tests for all the states. If the data's there, it's gonna look like this. And you shouldn't have to like go in and actually dive deep into a database to be able to just make a design change, or like make sure that an
Right. Right.
authenticated user looks this way and an admin looks that way or whatever. It's just it's nonsensical that we've had to work this way for so long.
I know. It's so beautiful, right? And that's what React really is to me.
Yeah.
That modularized, parameterized, like take this data in and show this thing, right?
Yeah.
And you can consider that thing totally isolated. I mean, in practice, it's often not, but like, for the most part, it's this encapsulated thing. You got to fiddle with stuff that comes in via context, which is kind of like the crappiest part.
Sure.
But there's things in Storybook that help you deal with that.
Yeah.
Or the part where it gets really hard is when you start doing data fetching in your components, because you're like, I would like my components themselves to do data fetching so that they can load, asynchronously and separately. And now you're screwed in Storybook, because now you're like, well, crap, my thing's going to try to go talk to a GraphQL database,
Right.
or a GraphQL API somewhere. And like, now what am I going to do? Now, how do I, well, guess what? We solved that in Redwood with the mocking. We use mock service worker, and it's beautiful. You just create a file called whatever.mock.js or .ts, and it represents what data you would want returned in your Storybook. And it'll just, as long as you hook it up right, and it's like super easy, then it'll just pull that data and it'll use that data to show you your thing, right? So if you're using cells, the data fetching stuff in Redwood, you can easily in Storybook work on your cell by using the mocking.
Wild. I love that.
And that's that's what we mean when we talk about integration. It's like thinking about all of these things that would be amazing if only you spent the time to like really integrate them well, right? Like to create this developer dream. And that's what we're trying to build.
And you see a lot of this trying to go into design tools, right? Like, so you have, Figma maybe has some integration where you can connect to your GraphQL server and get data like that. But this is actually happening in the product. It's not like some separate phase. It's like you can actually do that same thing utilizing cells and stories. That's amazing.
Yeah. And testing. So you use those same mocks in testing. So you use the same mocks across your tests so that you can also test and get whatever mock data you want. And then you get multiple different mocks, but there's a default mock that Storybook will use, because it's hard to tell, like it's annoying to tell Storybook all the time, like what you want. So if you just want one thing in Storybook for it to do, to make sure it's going to come back with the right stuff, but you could have multiple and you can tell it which one to use. If it's a little, you have to add another line of code, but the same mocking behavior works across both testing and Storybook.
Nice. Now I want to cover some of the language, because we've and then I want to get to deployments for sure. But I want to cover some of the language, because we've talked about cells and sides, and I want to make sure that everyone kind of knows the thinking behind those as we go into them. So, or as we continue to talk about them. So cells, tell me kind of precisely what those are with regard to a component and data.
So a cell is our primary way of doing data fetching. So the normal way in React that you would do data fetching for GraphQL is you do like you declare your sort of the query that you're going to run, and then you execute your query, and then that's going to have a loading state, and it's going to have a success state, and it's going to have a couple of different states that it goes through, and you're going to have a big conditional statement in your component that's going to be like, when it's loading it, show this thing, and when it's successful, do this thing. But what we didn't like about that was how it just messes, like the code gets really messy. Like you're putting all those things kind of in the same, embedded in this big conditional statement inside your component. And it's not very pretty. It's not a very nice pattern. And so we started thinking about it, and we were like, well, like all of these things really are just components. And so what if you were to declaratively be able to just declare them, so that you could say, okay, for this component, here's what the loading state looks like, right? And just and have a file where you export that. You'd be like, okay, export the loader looks like is this component, and then export success is this component, and export a failure is this component, right? It takes in props and spits out a component.
Sure.
And also, what if it's a list? What if you're doing a list query and the result is empty? Like that's kind of another state that you have to deal with. And it's like, in that case, it's this other component.
Yeah.
And so that's what Redwood cells are. It's kind of a veneer almost. It's a little bit of magic, but a cell it looks like a component the way that you name it. You just call it just ends with cell. So it's like, user list cell. .js or .ts, and it just exports these different things. And also you can, you define the query and you export the query. So you export query equals whatever your query is. You can also modify parameters that come into it with a before query thing, and modify the data that comes out of it that is then going to get passed to success. So it's basically an orchestration layer that's declarative. So then we run the query for you, right? We're like, okay, you exported the query. So give me the query. I'm going to run the query. And then during the different states, I'm going to just grab the thing that it needs, right? So I'm going to like, you exported a loading component. So like, give me that. And then you'll see that for a second. And then, oh, I got a success. I got some data back. So give me the success component and I'm going to give it the data that I got back. Right. But you might want to change in between the results of the query and giving it to the success component. You might want to change it. So there's a little kind of callback in there that you can do. An after, what do we call it? After query, I think we call it. So it's like before query and after query. Maybe, I forget now. But you can change the data before it gets to the query and after it comes out of the query.
Oh, interesting. In case you need to munch it or change it a little bit for that specific component rendering.
You can just, if you need to do a little bit of modifying of the structure to reorganize it from what the GraphQL gave you to what you really want to take in from the success component, then you can do that. And that allows you to really think about what you care about. You're like, I'm working on the successful state of this component. Like, boom, here you go. Like, here it is. Nothing around it. It's just the success component. It takes in props and it outputs what it needs to. And you're not looking at all this other crap that's around it, this big conditional, and you don't have to worry, and you just don't have to worry about it. And this also, like thinking long-term, this allows us to be in the GraphQL call so that we could do interesting optimizations in the future. Because instead of you running it, right, instead of you doing the actual query call to Apollo, Apollo client, well, it abstracts Apollo out.
Sure.
So that if we did want to change the GraphQL client, we could without you having to change your code because you're not doing anything Apollo specific in this case. And it puts us in the middle. We're now the middleman for the request response, which means that as we start thinking about how to solve problems like the waterfall problem, where you have a component that fetches some data and it has subcomponents, it's going to want to fetch and complete that data, that request before it gives it to its children. But the children might not care about anything that first, that parent query is doing. It might only need the ID of a user or something, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to wait, right? And then it finishes and then it passes down to the children because it's just the way that React renders. And so in the future, we might be able to optimize the way the GraphQL runs to parallelize things or combine things up or do whatever we want to do because we're in there. We have control over that process. So that's what cells are.
It's one of those little tasteful bits of magic that I really like because, as a designer, it's really nice to be able to just like pull off the one state that I need and like focus on that. And then also, like you said, to be able to opt into optimizations without having to concern myself with the changes to Apollo and whatnot. Like you've actually taken the work of having to know what those tools are that connect you to the database out of the way completely. And that's now a framework concern. And I'm sure that there's ways that you could dive into it, but like you said, you're going to get optimizations by kind of not concerning yourself with that.
Yeah, because and that's the beauty of something that's declarative, is that you're just saying what do things look like? Mm-hmm. What do you want it to be, instead of running it yourself, right? Instead of having all the imperative code around, do the actual query and here's the query and then deal with the different states. Like you're just saying what you want at the end of the day, and you let me, the framework, I'll take care of it. You just tell me what you want. I'll take care of it.
I love that. So that's cells. And I think that's a really great little abstraction around those concepts, because we've all seen components like this. They all look the same. They all look really gross. And it's really nice the way that you've organized that. So these components can be very clear and declarative. Now, before we jump into services, let's talk about sides. This is a really interesting construct that you have. And the two that Redwood ships with when you build a new Redwood app are going to be web and API. But tell me kind of what is the notion of a side, kind of the abstract notion of a side?
So the sides really are just how we break the main pieces of the app up. And right now there's only the two, right? There's the website and the API side. But they're really conceptually, it's conceptually really it's the API side, which is really the primary one. Like your application is a GraphQL API, and it may be consumed by one or more front end client. I call them client sides. And right now we deliver a React based web side, but that's just because like we started with web apps. Like web apps are the easiest thing to do, a lot easier than a mobile app, a lot more useful than a command line interface, for instance, or, a kiosk app or a car, something that runs on the dashboard of a car, whatever you would consume something from, some IoT device. Like the web app is sort of the standard, like easiest place to start. And that's kind of what we were interested in. And so that's why we call them sides. That's why they're distinct. And that's why we use GraphQL in order to communicate between them for that flexibility. Yeah. And eventually we would love for Redwood to have a setup for, it's like, well, what do you want? What are you building? Are you building a website? Are you building a mobile application? Are you building a command line tool? Are you building something else? And have all the Redwood goodness for not just building a web client in React. Maybe we'll have the ability to write a web client in Vue, right? Or something else. Or you want to build a native client with React Native. Like we'll almost certainly offer that at some point down the road, because that's such a natural fit. And you can reuse a lot of stuff between your web app and your mobile application. If you're using React, like if you write them in the right kind of way, like it's tricky, but like there is reusability that you can, like, even if you're just copy pasting and then modifying that, like whatever, it's still easier than like writing it from scratch with Swift or something. Or maybe we even have a Swift based front end too. Why not? I don't know. It's just, if it speaks GraphQL and we can help you do it, that's really what Redwood wants. Just wants to give you the ability to focus on your product and not worry so much about your framework.
So I'm curious, you've mentioned having a possible Vue website. If someone really liked the notion that you're after with Redwood, but wanted to do it in Preact or Vue or some other type of thing, are the pieces there right now that they'd be able to maybe plug in to that and kind of like build their own side like pretty easily?
We haven't spent a lot of time abstracting out the notion of sides. I think we've done a little bit. Peter has done, I think, a little bit about that, but we haven't spent a lot of time because it's not really our main concern right now. Our main concern right now is like get a 1.0 out. I'd love to do it before the end of the year. And we got a lot to do still. Like we haven't tackled SSR pre-render type stuff yet, which is what we're really focusing a lot on right now. So there's some big things that are really essential for 1.0. The concept of sides and like this sort of future of Redwood helping you do that is a little bit further off. Mm-hmm. So we don't make it easy, but it's not going to be too difficult, I think. Cause like there are some assumptions that it's like, oh, you have a website and you have an API side, but right now you can actually not have a website. Like you could just delete the web folder or delete the API folder, and Redwood's like, okay, I'm cool with that.
I'm creating a React app now.
Yeah,
with Storybook.
Well, right. I mean, and right. So you still get like a lot of the benefits on the front end. You get Storybook and testing and like all the things that we help you do there, integrating just beautifully with these different things. And for instance, we're working on this app called Repeater. That's at repeater.dev is the URL. And that's a background job scheduler for the Jamstack. So one of the problems that happens when you start deploying to something like Netlify is, guess what? Where do you run your right. like scheduled jobs, right? Well, there is nowhere to run them. Well, that's what Repeater is for. Repeater is a place where you can create one-time scheduled jobs that will execute immediately or would execute at some arbitrary time in the future, or recurring jobs that would be more like a cron type of thing for doing data aggregation or whatever. Or if you're just sending an email, you do a one-time thing and you're like, I don't want to wait for my email to send in band. So tell Repeater to schedule that. And then the job of Repeater is to make an HTTP call back to you. And you can create custom functions in Redwood very easily that will just be Lambda, just full Lambda functions. And so Repeater can just call back, it gives you the payload, and then you use the rest of the framework in the normal way. You use the rest of the API in the normal way. And you can do whatever you need to do when it schedules to call to you. Send emails or make some change in the database or do whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
And so so my point was with that is Repeater actually has no backend itself. So it's a Redwood application with no API because we built, and Rob Cameron, who's another core member of Redwood, built it as a Rails app because he wanted to use delayed job. So Repeater Dev backend is Rails that is using delayed job because he knows that super well. And he's like, I could just spin this up and like we could make this thing work. So he's like, all right, go do that. And so the Rails front end with no API talks directly to this. I'm sorry, the Redwood front end with no API talks the front end instead of talking to the Redwood API. There is no Redwood API. It talks to the Rails app, and that is the authoritative like data store. So and it works really nice because it's just GraphQL. It's all GraphQL, man.
Rob Cameron's in chat right now. He says, "Hey, that's me."
Oh, awesome! Hey, Rob.
I love that.
I don't have the chat up, so I can't see.
No, it's great. Yeah. So that's one of the big questions I think, with front end applications and Jamstack and all that is, you have these things we didn't even talk about jobs, but Rails is really good at giving you services and wrappers around being able to delay jobs, and it's really cool to hear how you're kind of still using some of those services, but you're kind of hiding them behind, obscuring them a little bit. You don't have to use like a full stack framework just to leverage those pieces.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the Jamstack serverless way. You have a variety of services that someone else is going to manage for you because you don't want to manage them. So things like background jobs is one. Uploading files, like there's a bunch of services where you could use to upload files because it's like I don't want to manage that. Like honestly, like really, do I really want to manage like uploading your files to S3 and like dealing with that in my database? No, absolutely. I just give me an ID and go, you store them wherever you want and I'll know how to pull them down and like you deal with it.
Yeah.
And I'll pay you to do that. Right. And so this is the serverless architecture aspect that is the Jamstack. Like this is the normal Jamstack kind of way to do things. But you can use those third-party services and integrate them into your app. And now you don't have to deal with that. You don't have to build that, right? So billing with Stripe, you want to do like store, inventory and store stuff with Shopify, or uploading files with FileStack, or dealing with your background jobs with Repeater. And so now you can collect these services, but as the core, you still with Redwood, you have a full stack web application with a database, and you're doing the things that you care about most, the things that are specific to you. Because guess what? Storing, handling uploads of files and storing files is never, ever going to be the thing that my business does or cares about, right? Like that's always the thing that I have to do in order to make my product. But I don't want to build that. Like that's not my core value, right? So how can we help you focus very specifically on your core value and let other people handle the thing that is their core value, so they care about it more than you ever will, right? And you just pay them a little bit of money to do it for you. And in the end, like that ends up saving you money in the long term because you're hiring fewer developers. And what's always the most expensive thing in building a company? It's always the people.
Yeah. I love this because there's a huge amount of pragmatism built into kind of, the documentation and the notion of Redwood that I'm very much attracted to. And it really is focused on building a product, getting a product to market, focusing on your core competencies. And like, maybe at some point down the future, like, in 10 years or whatever, you might want to like own, image and file uploads again. Maybe, probably not. But like, you're not restricted from doing that. But there's a very pragmatic way of like, just like, hey, what you need to do right now is build the application, build the product, build the service so that people will like want to use your thing. And you should delegate as much of the other things as possible. And I really like that about the Jamstack philosophy is, there's so many great services. What services can we use to get to market way faster?
Absolutely. And this, I think, segues nicely into deployment, where like Redwood makes it super easy to deploy to Netlify. So like you can create a Redwood app. You still need to spin up a database somewhere. We're working on ways to make that a lot easier. Netlify maybe will help you set up a database and get it running, and then you just hook in directly to it, whatever's not a big deal. Right now, you got to spin up a database somewhere on DigitalOcean or Heroku or AWS, wherever you're happiest with. And then your Lambdas are going to connect to that. And that's beautiful. It's really easy. Like a single command, like the migration, Prisma will handle the migrations for you. if you're using MySQL, Postgres, and it's just beautiful, right? Because you get your client is on a CDN, the Netlify CDN, for instance, super fast, globally distributed. And then your business logic is going to be deployed to Lambdas. And right now, this is a restriction with Netlify in that they deploy all Lambdas to US East 1 in AWS, right? But the roadmap there is like they're going the direction where it's going to be like, okay, well, eventually they'll let you choose where you want them, or they'll auto distribute them around the world or whatever. And now you could have your Lambdas around the world.
Yeah.
And then the last part is your database, and having distributed relational databases is still pretty challenging and expensive. But I'm really excited about things like Fauna. FaunaDB is a NoSQL, but serverless, like properly serverless, and like globally distributed, right? So like it really fits the Redwood use case super well. Only in that it's not Prisma there's no Prisma adapter for it yet. I think they will. Their plan is to do it eventually. And it's FQL. Like I want to use FQL, their query language, FQL, to do it. And it's still not quite as easy as I would like it to be. But like you can see in the future that eventually there will be choices for these globally distributed, serverless, relational things. I hope someday, but like just relational databases were just never built with this in mind. They just do not, they were never, they've got a restricted number of connections that you can make to them, which is like totally not the serverless way, right? Fauna's like, talk to me via HTTP, like all day long. Great. As many connections as you want. Like we'll handle it.
We got it. We're good.
Queue them up. It's all good. Right. And MySQL's like, I have 20 connections. So be careful. Right. And you're like, no,
use them wisely.
So, right. And so if you put your business logic on Lambdas, guess what? You could have an infinite number of Lambdas. So you could have an infinite number of connections. So now you have to add connection pooling. Like, so there's still some things here that are not fulfilling my long-term dreams of what Redwood can be. But that's why we're here to push vendors to make this stuff better. And part of the core thesis of Redwood really was, let's build this now before the infrastructure pieces are really perfect, so that once people realize how amazing Redwood is, like, and we get users and they're like, hey, vendors, we want to use Redwood, but your stuff sucks. And they'll be like, okay, I'm sorry.
Fine.
I'm going to make my stuff better so that Redwood is better, right? Like that was kind of our thesis. So I have no shame in saying like some of these things aren't optimal yet, because like we're early. We're not Meteor early, but we're early enough that we can help push the industry where we think it can go.
Interesting. Now, one of the things that you touched on is database, and you still have to kind of figure out the database piece of it. But it sounds to me like, Prisma is at least abstracting the direct calls to the database for you. So, if you're using a Redwood app, you don't have to necessarily on the web and API side of things concern yourself with, SQLs or MySQL or like Postgres or whatever, like the actual specifics of your database. That's all going to be abstracted away by Prisma.
Yeah. So you're writing JavaScript. You're not writing SQL. It's basically, they call it a query builder. So it's building the query for you based on, on the code that you're writing. So it's like, whatever dot, it's like DB, whatever your DB, the client dot, post dot, find one, and then you give it an object with the ID in it or whatever, right? So it's a query builder.
Yeah.
And that's nice because I don't want to write SQL, honestly. I mean, I love SQL's great.
Sure. But it's another one of those things that's way below product. Like
I just don't, for those cases, like I don't want to drop into SQL. Like I want to be in JavaScript as much as possible. And that's a kind of like, I want to think in JavaScript as much as possible, right? And Redwood lets me do that. Yeah. And Prisma's it's nice, right? And it handles a lot of the details for me about how this is going to be orchestrated, and it has a migrations thing, right? So really, we wanted, like for Redwood when we were building it, and when we started building it like 2 years ago, we were like, okay, we want some kind of an ORM. I wanted, like, what am I going to use instead of active record? Like, what's the active record of JavaScript? And we went and we looked at a bunch of the ORMs that were available, and there was a bunch, but none of them really held a candle to active record. Yeah. Like active record is a masterpiece. It is a one of the great human achievements. Like it's amazing, like how powerful it is. And then you go over to JavaScript and you're like, what is what what is this? Like, this is not okay.
Yeah, they're all cheap knockoffs of really, like you said, it's just a really amazing achievement, active record. I mean, it's a huge part of Rails that I don't think people realize. Like that is really the masterwork of Rails is active record.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? But it's become so amazing that it almost becomes unamazing in that you can do so many millions of things that it ends up with great amounts of complexity.
Yeah.
Like in the scoping that you can do, like you can do really interesting things with it. So interesting that like people go into your code base and they're like, I have no idea what the hell you're doing with active record here. Like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So it comes at a cost, perhaps.
Yeah.
Like terseness, you get what you get in terseness, you lose in maybe figure out ability. And so Prisma was very early, like they were like super early when we came across them, but like the fundamental architecture that they had and like how you would use it and how you define relationships and things, that was finally something that felt like, oh, this finally feels like something that could hold a candle eventually to active record. It at least is not making choices that preclude it from getting there.
Sure. Yep. Yep. Now I want to take a quick pause and just ask you, I know that I totally lost track of time. And so we're at like 3:12 right now. So I just want to make sure, maybe we can like start wrapping up. I just want to make sure that you don't have anywhere to be like right this second.
I do actually, but I'm going to,
okay.
let me just push it back real quick. I just,
sorry, I'm usually super good about like knowing like when we're approaching an hour, and I was enraptured with all the stuff that you were talking about. So I apologize for that.
Okay. I'm good. I can keep going.
Okay, cool. So maybe just like, we can start wrapping it up, maybe like 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
Cool. Perfect. Awesome. Let's see. So where do we get back in? I think at this point, I'll probably just kind of like ask you about like where you hope to see this going. Or I did want to cover auth, because I think that's one of the biggest things that people don't know how to even start with in a React app. So maybe we'll do auth, and then I'll just kind of ask you like, what your hopes are for the next 3 years of Redwood.
Sounds good.
Cool. Okay. So one thing that a lot of people ask us about on the show, and I want to make sure we sneak in before we kind of close out this episode, is auth. And I know that there's a lot of concerns about auth, React apps, there's like so many services. It sounds like, Redwood has a very kind of Jamstacky way of handling auth. And I'm curious what providers you work with right now.
So out of the box with Redwood, you can install very easily a couple of different auth providers and then have them up and running like in a couple of minutes. I actually have a demo of getting auth running in 3 minutes. I think it's 3.5 minutes. And it's nice. Like you go from no auth to installing auth and creating it integrates with Netlify identity. And within a couple of minutes, it's like, boom, you're done. You've got auth, it's on Netlify identity. You've got a login and sign up box, and you've got stuff in your code to where you can test whether someone's authenticated. And you can do it all in like 3 minutes, right? And that's true of all of the auth providers. So we've got Netlify identity, Auth0, and what else do we have in there? Magic links. Yep. You can go to the documentation and see.
Yeah, it looks like
they all are these days.
Netlify, GoTrueJS, Firebase, Go Auth provider, or Google Auth provider.
Yeah. We added that one recently.
And then awesome options for custom ones as well.
Yeah, and so nothing precludes you from kind of rolling your own. And in fact, the sort of the framework, we have like a mini framework for building an auth plugin, essentially, to where you could build your own. So nothing says that you have to use some third-party auth provider, and a lot of people don't. And so we want to make that really easy. But as long as you write it in a way that's going to speak this interface, that's going to talk in this interface, then it'll still integrate with Redwood in the same way that everything else does. And so you get the advantages of being able to use then the role-based authentication system if you want. So you can install one level, which is just tell me whether a person is authenticated at all, right? And it's just like, okay, the person is who they say they are, and now you can kind of make assumptions about whether they can do things. So this would be useful if you're writing like something that just has an admin section. Like let's say you wanted to write your own blog system, and you want to be able to log in and create posts, but just you, and you don't care about anyone else. And then you might just install it that first level. But once you start wanting to have multiple different roles, so you want a person who can edit posts and someone who can post them and maybe another person who can moderate comments or something, right? So now you've got 3 different roles. And so the role-based authentication that we also integrate, and you just import, just install and import another Redwood library for doing role-based authentication. And now you get the role-based stuff where you can test based on what the roles are associated with a specific user. And some of the providers have that integrated. So with Netlify Identity, it can actually store the roles for you. You could also do it where you store them locally. So if you didn't want to use their roles, which are very simple, it's just a list of roles, you could store your roles in the database locally if you wanted to do it differently for some reason. And we have cookbooks for how to do that.
Nice.
And so all of this to say, you can go from nothing to like a fully authenticated application in a couple of minutes. And and it's just like hooks. It's just like use auth, and you pull out like a login function and a log out function, and you can just call them, and they'll pop up like for Netlify Identity. Yeah. You call login, and it pops up the login dialog, and you log in, and boom, and then it gives you back your authenticated user. And we have the stuff in the site that will fetch that from the backend, so you can fill out more about the user on the backend. So it's like, okay, when a person logs in, I need the front end to know not only their sort of identifier in whatever provider you're using, but also I want to get their email that I store locally, and I want to get like some other data about them that's going to be shown in a nav bar or something. And there's a way that you do that on the API side where you just fill out an authentication thing, and the framework itself knows how to make that call over GraphQL to get the current user information and pull it back. And so that whole flow is handled for you. You don't have to worry about it, but it's still really customizable in what you want what data you want to be present in that authenticated sort of user data packet.
Yeah, and I really like this model because it makes it easy, but then also you're not tied to one vendor or like one style of auth. You really have control over all of it, but then you can still use the conveniences that you provide through the library, through the framework, just to get up and running, get started, and maybe take you all the way. Who knows? But you don't have to think about it at that deep level unless you want to.
Right. Like, do you want to build a 2FA system? No. Do you? Like, answer honestly. Right? No.
Yeah.
You let someone else do your auth for you. Like, you're going to spend way more money like dealing with broken 2FA stuff on your site than you are like paying Auth0 a couple of bucks every month, right?
Now back to deployment real quick. What are the current deployment targets? You mentioned a lot about Netlify and the integrations there. Are there other places that can easily right now be deployed to?
Yes. So you can deploy to Netlify. That was the first one. That's kind of what started this whole journey, is this idea that we could do full stack on the Jamstack with Netlify. And then we're like, well, Vercel's not much different. So we worked with them, and now you can deploy directly to Vercel, like 0 configuration, like super, super easy. So that's awesome. And then we were like, well, what if you want to like run it yourself on AWS or something? You want to handle your own Lambda layout or whatever, because Netlify has some restrictions, then you can do that, right? So we have the ability to deploy the currently just the API side to AWS, and you could then hook that up with, so maybe you deploy your front end to Netlify still, but you want to deploy your back end to AWS directly so that you manage it. You can do that. And we're working on other types of things like a full deploy on AWS, front side and so website and API side. Like, how do we make that possible? What about Fargate, being able to run it in a container so that you have no limitations? Yeah. Like right now, Lambda, you have certain limitations around code size. You've got cold starts. You've got a couple of different restrictions, runtime. So let's say you have a background job that you want to trigger with repeater.dev. Like, where are you going to run that? Well, if we make it easy for you to deploy your Redwood app to a containerized thing, then that could be where your jobs run, and you could let it run for as long as you want. Or maybe you want to run all your backend on Fargate so that you have no cold starts. You just run it all the time, or you run 10 of them all the time. You can do that, right? Because there's nothing about Redwood that is Jamstack specific. It's sort of like Jamstack optimized.
Sure.
But you can run it old school if you want. You could run it bare metal. Like, it's just Node, right? It's just Apollo server at the end of the day. So anywhere you can run Apollo server and a Node process, you can run the API side of Redwood.
Nice. Love that. Love hearing that. So we have just like kind of blown through our time today, and so I want to start wrapping up. But one of the things that I like to ask last is just kind of your vision for the near term future. So, what are you excited about? What you're bullish on? For the next, maybe 3 to 5 years. And it sounds like Redwood is really kind of the answer to that. So, I'm curious from you, what are you most excited about putting into Redwood or building into Redwood over the next 3 to 5 years?
I mean, it's a little hard to answer. I think it's really going to be what the user, what the community needs. And I don't know that I can predict all of that. I think it's going to be a lot of documentation. Like I want to have, well, there's two things that I really want. I want Redwood, well, three things. I want Redwood to really capture the potential in the Jamstack universe and this new development and deployment methodology. So that's one thing. And that I think we're executing well on. Number two, I want documentation that is like world class. And I think we've got a really good start with the tutorial. Rob Cameron, David Price, another core member, have put huge amounts of work in that. Peter, a bunch of external contributors have put a lot of work into the tutorial and the documentation that we have, but it's starting to get a little messy. And so I want to make sure that we maintain like world class, really deep documentation. Because that, to me, that's everything. Like you go to an open source project and you're like, this looks amazing. I want to use this. I heard about it on a podcast. And then you go to the website and it's like one crappy tutorial that is totally broken in like 12 different ways. And that's it. And maybe it doesn't even have a tutorial. And it's like a README, but the README doesn't, it's like a couple of code examples. And you're like, I don't even know like what the context of these code examples is. That person's gone, right? And you're just like, I don't have time for this, right? So I want Redwood to be like, oh, I have a journey, put me on the journey. Tell me how to do, like, if I want to go deeper, how do I do that? So I want world-class, like super world-class, like Stripe level documentation. Right? Like, to me, that's the gold standard, the bar. Right? Yeah. Stripe is amazing. Like they kill it on that. So I want that. And I want a world-class community, like the best community. Like, how do you build the greatest community? And it's really hard. And we're having to ask ourselves difficult questions about who's in the community, because it's not very diverse right now. Yeah. And it's like, we're taking steps to try to improve that, but it doesn't happen by itself. You have to work very, very hard to make that happen. And so we're asking questions about that and talking to people about how do we get the right people here? But it's also a very hard thing to go to people and say, hey, do you want to come do free work for me on my framework? And so it's a tricky question, right? So we're navigating those questions, but I would really love to have a community that people look at and they say, I want to be part of that community, and I can tell how much care they put into it and how helpful and kind they are and how much they want to help me succeed. And that just creates this spiraling sort of value in a community that I don't think you see very often in open source. I think you see it very rarely. And I'm wondering if we can do it differently. And we're putting a lot of time into thinking about how we can do it differently. So I think those are the things for Redwood that I want to see. In the greater ecosystem, I think Jamstack is going to continue to iterate and improve and become more powerful and less restrictive. Things like Lambda, like what's AWS, what's Amazon going to come out with next, right? Like they have all these pieces. Like how can we leverage those to make developers' lives easier? And in the little bit longer term, I would love to have to care less about what my data storage story is. Like it's really difficult right now. There's a million different ways to do it. There's relational, NoSQL. Like I want to not kind of have to care. Like right now, I don't have to care about where my front end goes. It just goes on CDN, done. Yeah. And then my business logic, I'm like, well, if we can get the Lambda story figured out and the restrictions become fewer and someone is going to orchestrate it for me, then it's like, boom, Lambdas everywhere. Yeah. Right. And they become super cheap. And I can have like a globally distributed, fully edge web app in like a couple of minutes, and it doesn't cost me very much. I think in 5 years, we can totally be there. Yeah. But then even longer than that is what I call a universal deployment machine, which does everything, including data. And it like, you're just like, I want to read data and write data, and like, you figure it out. You make indexes for me. You make it fast. I just want data. And you know, what's the CDN of easiness? Like how easy CDN is for like getting your front end out. What is that for data? I don't know. But that's what I want to see in 10 years.
I love that. And I feel like you have, all of the, the pieces in your experience, from doing so much with Rails, with GitHub, to Jekyll, to, Toml, which seems to be like a really important piece of, actually like controlling your infrastructure and whatnot. I'm just so excited to see you kind of leading this charge and having the vision and sharing it through Redwood. So if people do want to get involved in the community to learn more and kind of share their first learner experiences, how do they start doing that? How do they get involved?
So come to redwoodjs.com, and there's links there to our discourse forum and our Discord chat server, where you can, depending on what you're doing, you can engage in either of those ways. We're redwoodjs on Twitter. And if you want a free sticker, we will send you 3 free stickers literally anywhere in the world, as long as you have an address. We will send it to you completely for free. Go to redwoodjs.com/stickers and fill out that form right there. And I will send you 3 Redwood stickers, and you put on your laptop, and then you're a bona fide member of the community. And we love for anyone to be there. Builders, contributors, people just noodling around, people that are early in their careers, people that have been doing this for decades, everyone. We want everyone there. We want to help people build valuable stuff for the world.
Yeah. Well, I'm super excited to see how this project takes off. How can people find you about the internet and kind of see as you continue to develop Redwood?
My handle is Mojambo on Twitter. And if you can search for me on the internet, and you'll find me in the various places, and how to email me. So I'm easy to find. And Redwood.js on Twitter. Give us a follow. Give us a star on GitHub. That helps us a lot. If you want to see GitHub become more used and continued development, a star on GitHub is really valuable. It's a signal for others that there's interest there, and that it's going to be a long-lived product. So that's how you find us.
Awesome. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time, your abundance of time with us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain so much of this to me and our listeners. And I hope a lot of them just kind of join in and just get really excited about what you're doing. So thanks again for taking time to chat with us today.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure, and very happy to be here.
Awesome. We did it.
All right. Hour and a half.
Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry about that, but thank you for giving us that time.
It's all good.
Awesome. I think we're good. I think we answered most of the questions that had like come in as people were asking them. There weren't a ton, but I think one question that we didn't really get to, I didn't feel like it fit, was about lock-in. I think, let's see. One of the things that is a bit concerning about adopting a framework is sustainability over time. Will this still be around in a year or two? Well, I know there's no warranties in OSS. Can you comment on the extended life of Redwood? Yeah, I think that's mostly it, by Esteban Rojas.
Do you want me to answer that now?
Oh yeah, if you don't mind. And then I think we'll
okay. Yeah, it's open source. Like I intend for it to always be open source. I have no reason to ever license it any differently. Like I love open source. I want to give back. I have my success. I don't need, I'm good. So I just want to build and like, that's why I do this. Like I love just being part of this, a part of the open source community. So
yeah.
Redwood's always going to be there. If we ever build a company based around Redwood, I think it would be a different company. It wouldn't be like Redwood Incorporated. It would be something else that would then build things that rotate around the Redwood world. But like, it's important to me that Redwood is like pure in its sort of own way. That like contributors to Redwood feel like, they're providing value to Redwood and all the people that use Redwood, and that their contributions aren't just like feeding the corporate machine.
Sure.
That is like sucking all the value off of Redwood. Like that's not what I'm interested in. I just want to create value. So I don't even know what that looks like from a monetization perspective. If there's something there, I haven't really stepped back and thought about it a ton. We've noodled around it a little bit. Like, is there a deployment? Like, do I need to build the universal deployment machine? I don't know, maybe. But as far as lock-in goes, like you can run Redwood anywhere. It's all standard stuff. Like you can you can dig in. You could, I don't know, like we very much don't want it to feel like there's lock in, and we're taking steps to make sure that that's not going to happen, and that people don't, even if there is monetization, that it doesn't feel like it's a weird kind of monetization. You know, other companies have gotten in trouble with this lately, in names, but like it's dangerous. Like it's a tricky thing to navigate where you're like, hey, I made this cool open source thing, contribute. And then also like, I'm going to make a bunch of money on it.
Yep. Well, that's good to hear. Hopefully that answers that. And I think we're good. I want to let you get on with your day. Thank you so much again. And I think we're usually about like 3 or 4 weeks ahead. So this will air on React Podcast around then and go to, I don't know. I think quarantine kind of like knocked our numbers down, but it's about like, 7,000 React listeners. So hopefully we'll get some contributors and whatnot headed your way.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. And thanks everyone for listening.
All right. Hey, so I got no face up here anymore because of my OBS setup. But hey, thanks so much everybody for tuning in. And I guess you're just gonna see my Zoom meeting and who's up next, which is kind of exciting. I thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this and you want to hang out for future live recordings, for those who have decided that it was okay to stream them, just subscribe. Hit the bell icon and we'll let you know when we do the next one. Thanks so much for being here. You can hit us up on React